Gravitas live and direct from WION Studios in Washington, D.C.
Hello and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. It's 9 p.m. IST, 11:30 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. We're coming to you live from our studios in the U.S. Capitol. The city is ready to welcome some high-profile world leaders, including India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He'll arrive on the 23rd, that's Thursday. He'll meet his counterparts from the Quad, the Quadrilateral Dialogue, and he'll have bilateral meetings, including with President Biden in the building right behind me. That's the White House, the official residence of the American president. Well, he's not there today. Joe Biden is in New York. He has delivered his debut address to the United Nations General Assembly. The speech comes after the debacle in Afghanistan. The US president is under immense pressure. Today he tried some damage control. He said that he's not looking to engage in a new Cold War. And he said that the end of the war in Afghanistan is the beginning of a new chapter.
The United States will do our part, but will be more successful and more impactful if all of our nations are working toward the full mission to which we are called. That's why more than 100 nations united again around a shared statement, and the Security Council adopted a resolution outlining how we'll support the people of Afghanistan moving forward, laying out the expectations to which we'll hold the Taliban when it comes to respecting universal human rights. We all must advocate for women, the rights of women and girls to use their full talents, to contribute economically, politically, and socially. We've ended 20 years of conflict in Afghanistan. And as we close this period of relentless war, we're opening a new era of relentless diplomacy.
But Biden's assurances sound hollow because countries in the region are already facing the consequences of his botched-up withdrawal from Afghanistan. Look at what happened in India today. Indian authorities have seized nearly 3 tons of heroin. The consignment came from Afghanistan, 3 tons of it, worth close to $3 billion. This could be India's biggest drug haul till date. The shipment was seized at Gujarat's Mundra port. They've been seized by the Directorate of Revenue Intelligence, India's top anti-smuggling agency. How did this consignment reach India? Reports say it was shipped to Gujarat via Iran. Those drugs were marked as talc stones. Indian investigators are trying to determine exactly who is behind this consignment. So far, they've only confirmed that Afghan nationals were involved. Now, Afghanistan, we all know, is the world's biggest producer of heroin. 80 to 90% of the global output comes from this country alone. And the Taliban are one of the biggest drug suppliers in the world. Their dealings in opium fueled their return to power. Opium can be processed chemically to produce heroin. It is believed that the Taliban earn anywhere between $100 to $400 million through this drug business. 1 month into their rule, into the Taliban rule, the security threats from Afghanistan are only growing on every front. It started with terrorism, groups relocating to Afghanistan, making statements on Kashmir, and now Afghan drug lords sending heroin to Indian shores. Meanwhile, the Taliban have expanded their caretaker government today. New deputy ministers have been appointed. A total of 17 names have been added. Cabinet expansion already. Once again, there are no women ministers. The Taliban have shred all illusions of inclusivity. Listen to what Taliban spokesperson and Deputy Information Minister Zabiullah Mujahid has said, and I'm quoting, "Pakistan or any country has no right to ask the Islamic Emirate to establish an inclusive government in Afghanistan." Mujahid told this to a Pakistani newspaper. Why is he specifically calling out Pakistan? Because of Imran Khan. A few days back, the Pakistani Prime Minister made an announcement. He said Islamabad is negotiating with the Taliban for an inclusive government. Imagine the Pakistanis promoting inclusivity. The Taliban have shut the door on Imran Khan's face now. The message is quite clear. The Taliban now run the show in Afghanistan, and even Pakistan will have to bend to its will. They may have a firm control on Afghanistan today, but their rule is fragile. How does an unstable Afghanistan threaten South Asia? What kind of threat does it pose? What about those terrorists who are taking refuge in Afghanistan? Has America's exit created a new safe haven for terrorists and drug lords? Let's take these questions to our guests. Washington studios today is Ahmed Mohibi. He is former program advisor to the U.S. Department of State on Afghanistan. He's also assisted the United States military in various capacities during the war in Afghanistan. We also have with us Ms. Nadia Hashimi, a member of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council. She's also a writer and a pediatrician. And Frederick Etchfletz, a former chief of staff and Executive Secretary of the National Security Council during the Trump administration. Presently, he serves as the President and CEO of the Center for Security Policy. Ms. Hashimi, gentlemen, welcome to WION. Good to be here. Ahmed Mohibi, we were talking about what happened today, the drug seizure. We've also been talking about the terror threat now emanating from Pakistan, with various terror groups of all descriptions having made it their home base. You have advised the U.S. government and law enforcement agencies on all matters of Afghanistan. What do you think is the biggest threat? Because I'm assuming it won't be restricted to the country or the region. It is going to be felt by the rest of the world.
It is. Well, looking at Afghanistan producing 90% of the world opium, it's going to be a biggest finance for the Taliban to be able to fund and to build operations against regional countries in the world. And at the same time, we're looking into the U.S. exit strategy and the whole collapse of Kabul. It could be a threat, and for countries like particularly India, giving that right now what we have is words versus actions. Thousands of U.S. troops gone, and the regime that was built in the past 20 years is gone. So U.S. has limited resources in Afghanistan. China is not interested. China is already in the war. Russians are not interested. Iran, there are sanctions on Iran. So right now we have words, and there's less capability of U.S. intelligence and what's going to happen. So giving the opium, the Taliban financing, and their ties with Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups in Afghanistan, particularly looking into Jaish and also Lashkar-e-Taiba and the ISIS. So we are looking at the security threat to the regional countries, particularly India.
Right. Frederick, while a clear link to the Taliban with regards to this drug seizure has not been established, it is an open secret that the Taliban have been funding themselves through drug trade. And this development within weeks of them taking the reins of Afghanistan, how do you see this, and do you think that this is going to be their model going forward? That they'll do it more openly and legitimize what they've been doing?
I think it probably will, and it's troubling when we see Western politicians, particularly American politicians, who say that UN resolutions or stern warnings by the United States is going to get the Taliban to act like a civilized government. The Taliban is a terrorist organization. It's backed by Pakistan. We know that terrorists are in Afghanistan, heavily armed with weapons left behind by the United States. This means the pressure is on Pakistan to stop this situation from spinning out of control. And I think the world has to, pressuring the Taliban, I don't think is going to get anywhere. Pressuring Pakistan, the Taliban's principal sponsor, is what the world has to do. And I think American politicians should be very clear that if Pakistan does not cut off its support for the Taliban, does not insist that the Taliban act as a civilized organization, we will cut off all aid to Pakistan.
Interesting you mentioned Pakistan, because the Pakistani Prime Minister has been saying, give them more time. Interestingly, he also said that he's going to push for an inclusive government, and the Taliban have just said that nobody has the right to lecture us on inclusivity, including Pakistan. I saw videos earlier today of Taliban fighters tearing a Pakistani flag and shouting Allahu Akbar. Is there any country or government that can pressurize or work with the Taliban now that they have been given legitimacy by the world and made leaders of their own country?
I think Pakistan is the only country that has the influence, but it will still be difficult because the Taliban is a fanatical, radical Islamist organization. It does not care what the world thinks of it. It also knows that it will find people who will sponsor it. It will sell drugs. It will take funds from Russia, from China, from Iran. Probably not from Russia. I think the Russians are a little bit leery of dealing with the Taliban. But the pressure has to be on Pakistan. I think it's the only way we have to resolve this catastrophe that was left by the U.S. withdrawal.
I think that the Afghanistan crisis is the making of a lot of actors and players. And while we talk about Pakistan or China or even President Biden, Nadia, you wrote something very interesting in a recent piece for the NPR. You said all of the presidents who dealt with the situation in Afghanistan are responsible for the current state of affairs. While I agree with this, would you say that Joe Biden's withdrawal and the botched up exit is more to blame than the others?
It's hard to say. I think Joe Biden's handling of this evacuation, the catastrophe that we've watched unfold, is very acute, it's very fresh, it's very raw, and we visually were watching it, you know. The previous administration, of Trump's administration, arranged a deal which was an utter and total capitulation to the Taliban. It basically handed over 5,000 prisoners of the Taliban, gave them back their fighters, and said, yes, we promise that we leave, and please don't shoot us on the way out. It was an utter capitulation. So, you know, did we feel the impact of that here? No, we didn't. But the Afghan people in Afghanistan did, because after that deal was signed, an escalation in targeted assassinations, in violence across civil society factors, women judges were being executed. The people over there felt it very acutely, and that was the real signs of what was coming after the evacuation.
The US government has cut a lot of slack to the Taliban. They've even described them businesslike, and they've said we will judge them by their actions. But their actions are for the world to see, including the latest diktats which said that women will only be allowed to clean toilets, among other things, in government offices, and only those roles where men will not be able to work. What kind of a relationship do you see between America and this Taliban regime, and where do you see this going?
Well, as of right now, this is the question every American wants to get answers to it. But I think going forward, we're looking into a regime that has been designated a terrorist group. We're looking at, you know, Anas Haqqani, Sirajuddin Haqqani, the Minister of Interior Affairs, has been designated by the FBI. It's still on the website of the FBI. So I think what the Taliban has been telling the U.S. is that, look, we're going to cut ties with Al-Qaeda. We're going to help you combat terrorism. And back in 2001, U.S. wanted to build a strong institution in Afghanistan, kill Osama bin Laden. But right now, the Taliban are giving those promises. Look, Americans, we're going to help you combat terrorism.
But they're a terrorist group themselves.
Exactly. And then they still have ties with Al-Qaeda. They have family relationships, wives, husbands, families. They have property together. So I think, to me, personally, when I look at them, when I work in Afghanistan, Taliban and Al-Qaeda and all these Islamist groups, they share the same ideology. I think it's hard to see the cut ties from each other. But I think going forward, it's too early. Let's see what the Taliban are going to deliver in actions, not in words, because words, actions speak louder than words. And we're looking into whether the U.S. government is going to recognize them or not, because we're talking about 38 million Afghans living in humanitarian crisis. I was speaking to just past few days. A lot of Afghans are selling their cell phones or carpets because there's no income, there's no job. So we're talking about a humanitarian crisis. And at the same time, we're talking about a U.S. administration has no clue how they're going to proceed with Americans, with the Taliban.
You know, this thing about the humanitarian crisis, Nadia, someone I was speaking to said that this is a story that suits the Taliban. This is a narrative that suits them. They don't really care about attending UNGA sessions or recognition for that matter. What they want is money. And when they tell the world that, look, there is abject poverty and Afghans are suffering, then the likes of the United Nations chief and others say, okay, we need a way to channel that money into Afghanistan. Do you think that this is a catch-22 situation that the world finds themselves in? And when they send aid to Afghanistan, how are they going to monitor what happens to that aid?
It's absolutely catch-22, and I think a lot of countries around the world, including the U.S., where we're trying to decide what does our relationship going forward look like, we're thinking about the people on the ground, right? If we don't recognize the Taliban, how are we going to engage with them? How are we going to help the Afghan people? If we do recognize them, well, what kind of a statement does that make? And when we look at the humanitarian crisis and think about sending money over there, and thinking about how some of that will most likely go to funding the Taliban and their militant efforts, their extremist efforts, that has been happening. That will not be a new phenomenon. So even in the United States' presence in Afghanistan in the past 20 years, there have been some amounts of money going to the Taliban so that the United States could conduct the projects and the endeavors that it wanted to do there. That will only escalate going forward.
Frederick, there's domestic politics as well in this, and the Democrats would say that a lot of this problem is Donald Trump's making. He set a hard deadline for exit, which of course Joe Biden then extended. It was Donald Trump, under him, that the U.S. pressured the democratically elected government in Kabul to release 5,000 Taliban members, as she said, many of whom returned to the battlefield. They were the ones who brought the Taliban to the talking table. Would you say that this is a series of mistakes of successive American administrations that has, made Afghanistan the chaotic place it is right now?
Well, the Biden administration has worked hard to blame Biden's disastrous withdrawal on Donald Trump, and it just isn't fair. Trump had a condition-based withdrawal plan, and the plan would have stopped if the Taliban was not cooperating. Joe Biden suddenly withdrew. He blindsided the Afghan government, the Afghan military, American allies. The British Parliament has censured Joe Biden. He's been criticized by many European leaders. I think Indian leaders have condemned him. It was a catastrophe. He was advised by his military advisors not to do it, or at least not to do it this way. The reality is America wanted to get out of Afghanistan. It was a difficult decision. I think many of us realize it could be in the end, even under Trump, the Taliban would have taken control. But Biden botched this so badly, the Taliban rapidly took control and created this catastrophe, this humanitarian catastrophe in Kabul. It was a difficult decision. No one is happy with it, but I think we all know this could have been handled much better, and it is a dark cloud that will haunt the Biden presidency, I think, forever.
I'm curious, though, why would he do that? And the Biden team says that we inherited a deadline, but not a plan. There was no plan.
There was a plan. Of course there was a plan, and Biden has seen the plan. And what's interesting is that Biden reversed almost every Trump policy. And he said that he was somehow shackled to this policy. That doesn't make any sense. Biden could have changed this policy. Biden could have added additional conditions. Biden could have worked with the Afghan government to withdraw. Biden could have worked with America's allies who had troops on the ground in Afghanistan. And we all know that America's allies pleaded with Biden to postpone the withdrawal date, and he stubbornly refused. And I think that has hurt America's reputation significantly.
And it is being hurt with the decisions that have followed. I'm being told that we are out of time, but I want to quickly ask you, as world leaders gather this week in New York, and there will be some meetings in the building right behind us, do you see any substantive strategy emerging, or will this be more talk and Afghanistan is just now a footnote and everyone expresses concern but doesn't really do very much about it?
Well, I think for countries like China, they're lobbying really hard for the Taliban to be recognized. That's number one, what's happening. I think for the U.S. government, there are still, it was a bipartisan war, so I think both Biden administration and the administration before, so they're working on some sort of strategy, because in the past 20 years, U.S. did not have a grand strategy. So there was mistakes and failures both by the Americans and the Afghan government, a corrupt regime, and the president fled. So I think looking right now, it's time for the world leaders to think about how to pressure Pakistan, how to work with Iran, how to work with Russia, and all these regional partners in South Asia, including India. I think looking at right now, we're looking at the Taliban getting the recognition. There have been countries working for them. But I think they should not forget that instability in Afghanistan is instability in the world and in the region.
It is a glorious mess, and if they don't fix it, it'll spread everywhere else. I'm out of time, but Nadia,
absolutely.
Ahmad, Frederick, thanks very much for joining us here on Gravitas.
Gravitas live and direct from WION Studios in Washington, D.C.
Building alliances is easy. Repairing them, well, not so much. The new Aukus partnership is a classic example. It was discussed in months. It was announced in hours. What did it cost Joe Biden? Possibly his oldest ally. France's outrage is now a European rebellion. Top EU officials are speaking out, and they're not pulling their punches. Here's what the European Council President, Charles Michel, said. The elementary principles for allies are transparency and trust. And what do we observe? We are observing a clear lack of transparency and loyalty. Tough words there. Europe is accusing America of disloyalty. They're banding up with France. But honestly, what else was Joe Biden expecting? He double-crossed France, secretly negotiated with Australia and left them out of the new alliance. Any country with self-respect would lash out, and that's exactly what France is doing. Until now, they had no support. Most of the European countries were silent. And this gave Joe Biden some wiggle room. He was treating France like a disgruntled teenager. Give them some time and they'll calm down. That was the idea. Well, that's not an option anymore. EU foreign ministers discussed the Aukus fallout on Monday. The consensus was clear. Full solidarity with France.
Defensive alliance between these three countries. Last week, it was announced just on the same day, by accident, in which we were presenting our Indo-Pacific strategy. And certainly we were caught by surprise by this announcement. During the discussion, the ministers expressed a clear solidarity toward France, and this announcement ran counter to call for greater cooperation with the European Union in the Indo-Pacific.
And for a change, Europe is right. Joe Biden completely bungled this situation too. His interest in the Indo-Pacific is welcome, so is his intent to take on China. But was this really the best way forward? Backstabbing your oldest ally and springing a rude surprise on your partners. Not ideal. What kind of message does this send to allies? Well, first of all, Donald Trump abandoned the Kurds in Syria, then Joe Biden abandoned the Afghan civilian government. Now he's betrayed France. And unlike the Kurds and the Afghans, France is not helpless. They are a nuclear power to boot, the de facto leader of Europe now. So Paris is now forging new partnerships. Earlier today, President Macron spoke to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. What did they discuss? A joint strategy in the Indo-Pacific. Macron committed to strengthening India's strategic autonomy. He also promised to help build up India's industrial and technology base. So France is reaching out to like-minded partners. What about Joe Biden? Well, he's still making promises. We heard a few at the United Nations General Assembly today, but they won't really help. We've heard enough promises from President Biden. America is back, he says. Diplomacy is back. Back to what exactly? That's what Europe wants to know. The EU president is confused about Biden's messaging. And this is what he said: America is back. This was a historic message sent by this new administration, and now we have questions. What does it mean, America is back? Is America back in America or somewhere else? We don't know. For the last 4 years, the US had an excuse. It was called Donald Trump. His intentions were clear. America first, he said, the rest of the world be damned. It wasn't the perfect approach, but at least he was honest about it. Then came Joe Biden. He promised America's comeback. He promised to repair alliances. But what has he achieved? A European rebellion. We've seen it repeatedly in Biden. He talks about multilateralism, but acts on his own. Take Afghanistan, for instance. NATO members were clearly unhappy with the pullout. They wanted Biden to extend the deadline for withdrawal. What did the president do? Ignore them. Same with Aukus. Biden denied France a lucrative submarine deal. We're talking about $66 billion here, not a small amount. And he did not even consult President Emmanuel Macron. He just informed them. Those are two completely different things. You inform adversaries, you consult with allies. The fact is, Joe Biden's foreign policy is a lot like Donald Trump's. The same chaos, the same unilateral bravado. The difference? Trump was open about it. Joe Biden, not so much. And India, too, will be watching these developments very closely. The interest in Indo-Pacific, like I said, is good, but the trend of dumping allies is not. Earlier today, India's Foreign Secretary talked about the Aukus alliance. He dismissed comparisons with the Quad, saying that Aukus does not affect Indian interests. Listen in.
Quad and the Aukus are not groupings of a similar nature. Aukus is a security alliance between three countries. We are not party to this alliance. From our perspective, this is neither relevant to the Quad, nor will it have any impact on its functioning.
Joe Biden is effectively shooting himself in the foot. He wants to take on China, but for that, he will need a broad alliance. He will need Europe. He will need India. New alliances are not the issue here. Repairing old ones, that's the big priority. And for Biden, time is running out because in the process of fighting a hegemon, he is turning into one. Here's another reality that America does not like discussing. Gun violence. The United States accounts for more than half of all gun violence deaths in the world, yet guns are seen and marketed as a symbol of freedom in this country, especially now, when polarization is at its peak. Since last year, there hasn't been a month when we haven't seen reports of Americans going on a rampage with their firearms, some of them as young as 17. On Monday evening, we set out in Washington, D.C. to find out why the U.S. has failed to rein in gun terror, the extent of gun violence in this country, the accessibility of gun stores and weapons in the United States, the eligibility criteria to buy firearms, and the ease with which one can buy them. Here's what we discovered. America and guns, guns and America. It's a touchy chemistry. It's something that most people are not comfortable talking about, but they must talk about this because this is an issue that affects all Americans. 58% Americans or someone they're close to have experienced gun terror in their lifetime. 100 Americans are killed by gun violence every day, 100 every day. 230 are wounded or shot at. America has clearly failed to control gun terror, and the onus of this failure lies on those who sit in the building behind me, the US Capitol. They failed to legislate, they failed to come up with an effective deterrent in controlling gun violence. And the repercussions of this failure are being felt not just by the people in the US Capitol, but across the country. 3 million American children witness gun terror every year, some even perpetrate it. Last year alone, there were numerous instances of teens with guns going on a rampage. Like Kylie Rittenhouse, a 17-year-old teenager who killed 2 people and wounded another at a shooting in Kenosha. Meanwhile, women in this country are 21 times more likely to be killed with a gun than women in any other high-income country. At least 1 million American women alive today have been shot at by an intimate partner. Access to a gun enables such terror. It makes an abusive partner 5 times more likely to kill his female victim. Let me show you just how easily guns can be accessed in America. So I'm at the US Capitol, and to try to understand the scale and magnitude of this problem, the gun culture of America, let's try and take some help from another American export, which is Google. I'll go to Google Maps on my phone, and I will look for gun stores, S-T-O-R-E-S. There you have it. This is the US Capitol. This is the blue dot where we are. And now you'll see all of these red spots. These are all gun stores. These are all places that sell guns. We tried calling some of them. They were not very welcoming. But we can tell you that it's very easy to go and buy a gun if you are an American. Every state in the US has its own gun laws. Washington is a part of the District of Columbia. For the longest time, it was illegal to possess a gun or firearm here. Then lobbies pressurized and rules changed. Today there are gun stores in every nook and corner of this country. If you happen to be looking for a gun dealer in Washington, D.C., be prepared to be spoiled for choice. Of the many stores that we saw on the maps, we decided to come to this one. It's called Realco Guns. Very interestingly, this is on the main road. This is a busy road here. And they have this banner. And they have the flag of America right here. And it says gun shop, enter at the rear. So we tried to enter at the rear. And we saw at least 4 to 5 people inside the shop. It was like any other store with lots of guns on display. Not toys, the real deal. This is the first time I've seen so many weapons in one place. For sale, with price tags written on them, anywhere from $1,100 and upwards. But they refused to speak to us, and they said it's their policy to not talk to the media. That's what they said. So clearly, gun shop owners on their guard and a little cagey when it comes to talking about their business and how it continues to flourish. I am a journalist.
Okay.
I'm from India.
Okay.
And we are doing a story on guns in America.
We don't do stories here.
Can I just talk to you for if you don't like it, you can remove it.
No, that's fine. No. We don't talk to the media. We don't talk to the press.
Why is that?
Like that. Just because. So, but yeah, we don't.
Most gun stores have strict rules against broadcast. These rules, however, are relaxed for those looking to buy arms. The eligibility criteria are a bare minimum. A person must be 21 or older, not stand convicted of weapon offenses, and not have a history of violent behavior. The process, too, is quite simple. First, go to the firearms dealer in your city, then make them contact the FFL, or the Federal Firearms Licensing Office. Then ask the dealer to send your purchased gun to an authorized dealer, There will be some interviews, some background checks, and soon you'll have a brand new weapon in your hands. Thanks to this process, Americans bought more than 23 million firearms in 2020, and 20,000 Americans were killed in gun violence the same year. 24,000 others killed themselves with a gun. America has not seen such numbers in 20 years. And Washington is not doing very much to stop these numbers from growing. 48% of Americans see gun terror as a very big problem today. But for decades, their representatives sitting in this building have been bending the seat of democracy to powerful gun lobbies. They have failed to come up with laws to safeguard Americans. They failed to secure American families and American futures. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay, and this is the State of America of 2021. In May last year, then President Donald Trump announced an ambitious mission, Operation Warp Speed. The plan was to develop, manufacture and deliver Wuhan virus vaccines, and that too at top speed. More than a year later, Warp Speed has slowed to a crawl. Americans are not taking the vaccine. A fourth wave of the virus is gripping the US. Nowhere is this crisis more visible than at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. We were here this week. The foreground is covered with more than 600,000 white flags, 600,000, one for each life lost to the Wuhan virus. It's a fitting tribute, but also a curious one. How did the world's biggest power succumb to a virus? How did it fail where other countries have succeeded? Here's a report. These flags are a monument to America's greatest tragedy. A tribute to more than 600,000 lives lost. A reminder of the empty seats at dinner. As you walk through this field of flags, it's difficult to ignore the scale of this crisis. Was it inevitable, or was it a failure of leadership? The United States has a surplus of vaccines. They can inoculate all Americans twice and still spare enough doses for export. Teenagers are getting jabbed. Senior citizens are getting booster shots. Clearly, availability is not the issue here. Implementation is. America began mass vaccination on 14 December 2020. They had time, doses and approvals, plus a Hollywood-esque mission, Operation Warp Speed, that's what they call it. Yet the vaccination campaign was less warp speed and more of a crawl. This is the total population of the US, 328 million. 54% of them are fully vaccinated, 63% have got at least one dose. A gentle reminder here, the US started vaccinating back in December 2020. We are in September now. They had 9 months to vaccinate 328 million people. Simply put, they failed. Compare this to India, a country of 1.38 billion people. It does not have America's infrastructure, but it has almost 4 times the people. It also has poverty and illiteracy, major obstacles to vaccination campaigns. Yet India has already inoculated 14.5% of its people. That's nearly 800 million doses administered. What about the US? Just 384 million doses. Look at the daily vaccination rate, 9.2 million in India, just 8 million in the US. The leaders here in Washington are not being able to send across a message that the vaccine is non-negotiable. America is failing to vaccinate its people, and the result is here for the world to see. I'll share some numbers with you. On the 16th of this month, the United States recorded 170,000 new cases. 292 Americans have died of the Wuhan virus in the last 24 hours. 827 died the day before, and more than 2,500 the day before that. These numbers may not make it to international headlines, but there's no hiding the truth on the ground. And here, in Washington's National Mall, there are 650,000 white flags. They stretch as far as the eye can see, with each flag honoring an American lost to the Wuhan virus pandemic. There are 600,000 flags here, but the Wuhan virus deaths are still rising. They have crossed 675,000, making this the deadliest pandemic in American history. even worse than the Spanish flu of 1918. A century of medical advances, a century of preeminence as a superpower, yet the US succumbed to the Wuhan virus. Makes you worry about the next pandemic. Will lessons be learned, or will more flags cover the National Mall? Some world leaders are dead set on denying the science, like Brazil's president Jair Bolsonaro. He's in New York for the United Nations General Assembly, unvaccinated and roaming the streets. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson tried convincing Bolsonaro to get the jab. No luck. With a broad smile and shrug of the shoulders, Bolsonaro replied, "Not yet."
It's a great vaccine. I have AstraZeneca. Thanks, everybody. Get AstraZeneca vaccine. I have twice.
US laws give Bolsonaro a free pass, but New York restaurants don't. They require vaccination proof for indoor dining. So Bolsonaro and his team ended up on the street, a slice of pizza in hand, with a side of public humiliation. This time last year, we were helpless against the Wuhan virus. It overwhelmed hospitals and took away loved ones. This year we have vaccines, but not the will to take them. America's COVID crisis is a generation-defining tragedy. It is painful, traumatic, also avoidable. Washington Bureau, WION, World is One. The COVID crisis may be recent and temporary, but there's another silent crisis that has plagued America, especially the American capital, for centuries. It's called racism, America's original sin. Throughout the summer of 2020, the US burnt in the flames of racial inequality, a fire that was sparked by the killing of George Floyd, a black American who was choked to death by a white cop. His death became a watershed moment for Americans. Millions rallied together to tell the world that black lives do matter. Today, a memorial near the White House, a 2-block-long pedestrian plaza, serves as a permanent symbol of that movement, a reminder of America's dark past and its complicated present. Here's a ground report. This is Washington, D.C., said to be one of the most progressive districts in America, the most gay-friendly. D.C., for example, made same-sex marriages legal in the year 2010, a full 5 years before the U.S. Apex Court decided that same-sex marriage was an American right. Washington, D.C. is home to a significant African-American population, and there's a story to that, too.
That nothing was wrong. And it was just another year.
It's a story that dates back to the 16th of April, 1862. That's when the slaves owned in Washington were emancipated, a full 9 months before the Emancipation Proclamation.
The system is guilty as hell.
Washington immediately became a city of freed slaves. Today it is the headquarters of the Black Lives Matter movement. In fact, a permanent installation is being built here, right on the road leading up to the White House. Once finished, the memorial is expected to look something like this. Thank you for speaking with us. You call yourself the Truth Conductor.
I'm the Truth Conductor. Yeah.
What is that? What does that mean?
I'm just a passenger in life trying to show people the way to righteousness. You know, we got to stop hating each other because we disagree. We're talking at each other with a lot of hate and division and animosity. But we got to start talking to each other with some love and some understanding. Nobody's perfect. Everybody got some isms in their closet. So why can't we talk to one another? You know, and stop talking at each other.
Who appointed you the Truth Conductor?
Huh?
Who appointed you to this post?
God appointed me. One day, I was sitting in a park where me and my wife is in the Philippines, and I was missing her, and all I heard was Truth Conductor.
President Biden has campaigned to, quote-unquote, restore the soul of the nation.
We cannot and will not allow extremists and white supremacists to overturn the America of Lincoln and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. to overturn the America that has welcomed immigrants from distant shores.
Ironically, data shows that hate crimes against blacks and Asians has gone up since Joe Biden took office. Los Angeles, for example, hate crimes against blacks went up 90% in the first 5 months of 2021. Pew survey conducted in April 2021, 21% of black adults said that they fear someone might threaten or physically attack them. This is expected to be the road to inclusivity, the road to reform that Joe Biden and several presidents before him have promised. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay for WION World is One from the Black Lives Matter Memorial Site in Washington, D.C. Those were the biggest stories of the day from the US and around the world. Now let's tell you what else is making headlines elsewhere. It's time for Gravitas Global Headlines.
French President Emmanuel Macron speaks to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi about cooperating over the Indo-Pacific region. This development gains special significance as France deals with the fallout from Australia's scrapping of a $40 billion French submarine order. In his opening remarks at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, UN Chief Antonio Guterres urged the US and China to engage in dialogue, warning of an increasingly divided world. The Taliban government in Afghanistan expands its cabinet by naming new deputy ministers, failing to appoint any women despite an international outcry. Meanwhile, the Taliban spokesperson says that girls in Afghanistan will be allowed to return to school as soon as possible. The Pentagon says a drone strike hit a vehicle traveling in rebel-controlled northwestern Syria on Monday, killing a senior al-Qaeda leader. Pentagon spokesman John Kirby said the airstrike was conducted near Idlib, adding that no civilian casualties have been reported due to the strike.
I apologise to those Afghans affected by this data breach and with whom we are now working with them to provide security advice.
The UK Ministry of Defence apologises after a data breach put the lives of more than 250 Afghan interpreters at risk by leaking their email addresses. These interpreters had worked for the British forces. The ministry says an investigation has been launched into the breach. The European Court of Human Rights rules that Russia was responsible for killing Kremlin critic Alexander Litvinenko in 2006 in London, supporting the findings of a British inquiry that concluded that President Putin probably approved a Russian intelligence operation to murder Litvinenko. Melbourne riot police resort to using pepper spray, foam baton rounds and rubber ball grenades to disperse violent protesters against mandatory COVID-19 jabs for construction workers. This as more than 1,000 protesters marched through the centre of Australia's second largest city. In what is being described as a rare incident, a swarm of bees has killed 63 endangered African penguins on a beach outside the popular tourist destination of Cape Town in South Africa. The area is a national park and the Cape honeybees are part of the ecosystem. The pressure is mounting on Barcelona manager Ronald Koeman after another abject performance saw his team just about salvage a 1-1 draw against lowly Granada in the Spanish league. The hosts fell behind after just 88 seconds and were trailing till the final minute when they were rescued by a header from centre-back Ronald Araujo. Barcelona have just one win from their last 4 games across competitions. The Australian women's team have extended their world record ODI winning streak to 25 matches with a 9-wicket thumping of India in the series opener in Mackay. 18-year-old pacer Darcy Brown picked up 4 wickets as the hosts restricted India to 225 for 8. Rachel Haynes, Alyssa Healy and Meg Lanning then struck half-centuries as Australia chased down the target with 9 overs to spare.
And with that, it's a wrap on the second edition of Gravitas US Edition. In the last 2 days, we've brought you stories on America's past and present, ground reports on the pressing issues it needs to tackle: racism, gun violence, the COVID crisis. We've also held discussions on the themes surrounding the upcoming General Assembly session, like India's role in the changing geopolitical dynamics and the growing Taliban threat in South Asia. Tomorrow on the show, we'll focus on the facilitators of this threat: China and Pakistan, two countries that plan to use the Taliban to their benefit. The Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, has been cheering for the Taliban. He says they've broken the shackles of slavery. He says he wants the world to incentivize them. His government is running a sophisticated network of financial, political and diplomatic and even military support to the Taliban. The aim is quite clear. Pakistan wants to make Afghanistan its sixth province and use it to gain what they call strategic depth against India. China's intentions, on the other hand, are a mix of insecurity and power ambition. Last month, Beijing rolled out the red carpet for the Taliban. This meeting was primarily about Xinjiang, the province where China is persecuting Uyghur Muslims. There is resistance, and unfortunately for China, Xinjiang shares a border with Afghanistan. Beijing fears there could be trouble on this front, and by aiding the Taliban, it hopes to eliminate the chances of any trouble. What does Beijing get in return? A corridor to Central Asia, plus a treasure trove of minerals. The Taliban need money, and China would be happy to provide it. In fact, the Chinese are wasting no time. Just last week, there were reports that the Chinese mining giant one of the mining giants was looking to exploit copper deposits in Afghanistan that are worth more than $50 billion. So we have two countries, one looking to fill its coffers and the other looking to fulfill its ambitions. They call themselves Iron Brothers, and now they have the Taliban as a force multiplier. What repercussions will the Pak-China-Taliban nexus have on South Asia? And what can the world do to counter what we're calling this new axis of evil? We'll discuss this and more on Gravitas tomorrow. Make sure you don't miss it. Signing off from Washington, D.C. with Gravitas Images. Thanks for watching.